Hello, welcome to Girls Right Now Live Unmuted. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's pre-show. I'm Filomena, a Girls Right Now first-year mentee.
And I'm Kayla, a Girls Right Now first-year mentee. We will be your MCs tonight and are so thrilled to be here live with tonight's Agent of Change Honoree Masuma Ahuja, author of Girlhood, Teens Around the World in Their Own Voices, which just came out in February. It is such an inspiring book that vividly details what it means to be a young girl in our society.
Thank you to everyone who submitted questions in advance for Masuma. We'll be able to take one or two more from the audience towards the end, so feel free to use the Q&A feature to ask. Let's get into it. Masuma, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be here, and I am sorry that I'm not physically, virtually on screen there with you guys because my internet is down.
So, what is the most influential or interesting story you have encountered or wrote about?
It's such a big question. I hate to pick one story as above or more than any other. And I find that the ones that stick with me are generally stories that happen around the stories that I'm writing very often. So I'm a journalist and I write and report about women's and girls' lives. And what generally ends up staying with me is not the stories that I end up publishing, but the conversations I have with people while we're walking their dog or we're having dinner together. And the one story or the one girl who stayed with me that led to this book, I was in a village in India, in central India. And I was talking to girls who are change makers, like all of you, in their communities. They're fighting back against child marriage. They're making sure that girls have clean toilets in their schools, that girls can play sports. And in having those conversations with them, it became very clear to me that there was so much more about their lives that I related to from the outside and that felt very similar to lives of girls in other places I had lived that I'd never seen, where we were talking about, the music they listened to. And they were asking me questions that really stayed with me. One in particular that I really remember a lot is, this was right in 2017 and right after the first Me Too stories came out. And we were sitting down for dinner one day and I was at this girls' empowerment camp and these girls sat down with me, we're having a chat. And then one of them who was fighting in her community to make sure that all the girls stayed in school and didn't have to get married young. And she turned to me and she was like, is it true? You're coming from America and I've heard that girls are completely free in America. Is that true? And that really stayed with me because on one side, we were having all these conversations about the ways in which women are still trying to fight back and are harassed and assaulted at work, but also for a girl in a small village in India, it felt like America was a place where girls could be completely free. And that really stayed with me.
Well, I have another question. I find what you just said to be so interesting and so intriguing, and about how meeting these different girls and how they've inspired you and how you've hold on to their stories. And, Girls Right Now is all about that, in my opinion, is giving girls the voice and allowing them to make themselves heard and allowing them to express their opinions and their beliefs. So one question I have is, why do you feel it's important to support Girls Right Now work? What aspect of the work done by Girls Right Now has resonated with you?
I think that it's just what you said, the very core mission of helping empower girls to tell their own stories and to know that there is an investment in their voices. Because growing up, I definitely didn't feel like I grew up between countries and didn't feel like I ever read books by people like me who lived through the world in the ways that I did. I was never encouraged by teachers or by people in my community to share my own voice and to share my work, and that I had anything interesting or important to say, which is just such a shame because we all have interesting and important things to say. And I think it's really important and powerful and necessary that something like Girls Right Now exists, because it's investing in girls and giving them tools to tell their own stories, and giving them the space to unmute themselves, to like tie into this theme, but really to speak out their truth.
That's amazing. It's true. Girls Right Now it's something like so amazing. Ariana Dowes asks, how did you gain the confidence to share your writing?
With so much difficulty is the real answer. As I said, I definitely wasn't the kind of person who was like a favorite of any English teachers in schools or anything like that. I didn't consider myself a writer for a very long time. So my background is I'm a journalist. I worked at the Washington Post and then at CNN, but my jobs were always jobs where I was helping other people's words get out into the world. So it wasn't ever my words. And I was just convinced that I never had anything interesting or important to say. And that, other people had interesting and important things to say, because the stories I wanted to tell didn't ever look like the stories that I was helping put out there, just because most of these places where I was working and most of the teams I worked on were very white. I'm not white, very male dominated, not a man, very like US centric. I'm an immigrant several times over. I just thought that I didn't have anything interesting or important to say. And journalism to me felt like an easy way into this, because I wasn't telling my own stories. I was telling other people's stories. So I could just focus on telling other people's stories. And the more I started doing that, the more I would hear back from people saying, wow, thank you for sharing so-and-so story. It really resonated with me. And as I kept hearing that, I realized that I maybe have something to say myself too, and that I should start sharing my own words, or start deliberately picking the types of stories that I want amplified, and not just doing what everyone else around me was doing.
I find that to be very interesting and powerful, how you talk about, coming from this past where you felt like your stories weren't that interesting and you weren't seeing them, being published, and then finding that power to actually make, these stories that aren't being told heard. And that leads me to wondering, what inspired you to combine your passion for journalism and storytelling with feminism and girlhood?
I think it was the fact that I didn't see the stories that I wanted told growing up, and the only way to create space for those stories was for me to do it, because if I was going to wait for someone else to tell the kinds of stories that I wanted in the world, then I'd just keep waiting. And I was constantly drawn to stories about women and girls. And I wanted to help create more space for women and girls to tell their own stories, because I understood that there aren't that many spaces for us to just exist and share our work and share our thoughts and our imaginations and our creativity and our voices. But it doesn't exist, especially if you don't belong to certain privileged groups and certain geographies. There isn't space for your story. So it was very much, this is what I know how to tell stories, or I know how to amplify other people's stories. It's a thing I'm good at. And also the stories I want shared into the world selfishly are the stories that I wish existed in the world. So a little bit of this is just, I'm putting out into the world what I wish existed, and the books I want to read and the stories that I want to read.
What was the first story that you feel really showed, that you wrote, that really brought this world and stories that you wanted to be told? What was the first story that you truly really felt proud of?
So my answer is going to be, it wasn't really a story, so I'm kind of cheating. But in 2014, I did this project at the Washington Post where it was, this book had just come out, some of you might know it, by Sheryl Sandberg, called Lean In, and everyone was talking about leaning in and women in the workplace. And it didn't feel like, I had a lot of questions where I was like, oh, this is interesting. The book's basic premise was women should take up more space in the workplace. And I was just like, oh, this is interesting. I don't feel like there are opportunities for me, at least, to do that. And I started calling. I was 24, very much the young person in the newsroom. And I started going around desk to desk and talking to lots of different women in the newsroom and being like, I'm really interested about, the conversations you're having about what it is to be a woman in the workplace. Because for me, like my mom's parents didn't let her work because that wasn't what a woman was supposed to do. And so I was very conscious of like, it's changed so much in one generation. And then I live in a different country than where my mom grew up. And everything, just the context feels very different. And so I was bringing that to the story, and I was going around talking to all these women, and I started calling together these meetings where I remember it would just be like 25 women in a conference room, and we would just talk about like our experiences. And the more we talked about it, the more we realized that there was something powerful here to look at how things have changed, even from the women who are like in their 40s and 50s to someone like me entering the same workspace as them. And so I commissioned this project. I kind of went rogue where I had no power at all, but I was like, we should do something. And I've decided we're going to do it. And I had like enough people who were at that point invested in it because we were having like these weekly meetings where we were talking about this. And we decided to interview a bunch of women. And it ranged from, so I was living in Washington, D.C. at the time. So it ranged from like the D.C. police chief, Kathy Lanier, to someone who was working like in the Obama administration, to the woman I interviewed who was the daughter of refugees from Vietnam, and she was running a tech startup now. And we talked about like stability and how for her parents, a job was like a source, you know, they needed to like pay the bills and pay rent. And she was taking this giant leap into uncertainty. And the finished product I thought was really beautiful because we had, I think, like 15 women's stories from different walks of life, different types of lives, different careers, different ages, and looking at what their experiences had been like. And I think it was slowly starting to lead the way into the kind of work I love doing most, which is bringing together a lot of different people's stories to create a portrait of something bigger.
So you talked a little bit about being really young, 24, and going around your workplace and asking people about what it means to be a woman. So what advice do you have for other emerging writers who are also very young?
I think the most important thing is that what you have to say matters. Going back to what I said earlier, I was talking about earlier, I really struggled at that point where I didn't feel like I had anything important to say yet. And I was very much in awe of everyone around me. And I didn't feel like I was writing at the level that they were or thinking at the level that they were, and that they all had just like much more interesting things to say. But no one else has lived in the world exactly as you have. And no one else has experienced the world as you have. And no one else is thinking the thoughts that you are. So what you have to say and what you have lived and what you want to write matters and is important, and no one else is going to do it. And just because they aren't saying the things that you're thinking doesn't mean that the things that you're thinking aren't important.
And you mentioned how it was difficult to get into the right mindset or to actually be able to do the things that you wanted to write about because of not of your how you felt about what you wanted to say. But what was the most difficult or interesting part of your writing process about putting these thoughts that you had onto paper?
So my writing process is very much like a thing where me growing comfortable sharing my words started with me writing emails to two friends. It was literally two friends. I did not feel comfortable writing to anyone else. And then they both had really positive things to say about my words. And then I went from 2 friends to 5 friends. And then I went from 5 to like 15. So it was very slowly, I was starting to share with like a broader and broader group of people. And I was really surprised that the things I was writing resonated with people, and people who moved through the world differently, who maybe like weren't experiencing the same things I was. They wanted to read more and they wanted to know more, and they found what I was saying interesting. And that with every like positive reinforcement or every person telling me I feel seen by your words, or it made me think about my own life differently, it made me more comfortable sharing more of my words, if that makes sense.
I just wanted to say really quickly, as said in the chat, if you have any questions at all, please type in the Q&A feature. It'd be really great.
So, you talked about, your whole writing and actually getting into it. So one question I have is, what do you do in the research or prep work before or during your writing process? And when you have an idea about what you want to write, how do you actually put it into words?
That's a really good question. So I generally don't feel like I'm ready to write until I know a lot about the thing I want to write about. So I do a lot of reading. I try and read around, like I try and read around everything, so not everything, but a lot of what is out there about a topic or a time period or other thought about whatever it is I'm writing about. Just getting a sense of like, where does this fit within, what other people have said about it, especially if I'm reporting something, I'm going to really like dive into the research to get a sense of how this fits into the larger framework. And also, what else should I be reading? What else do I need to know? What makes this interesting, or, where have other people taken this? And then I sit with that for a while. And generally it's just like, oh, what do I have to add to this? Do I have anything to add? And that's always my worry. And then I start that's where I stop generally, and I get really overwhelmed. And I am the kind of person who deals very well with a deadline. So I'm good if like someone is telling me to do something. I am less good if it's just like me on my own. And then I remember having a conversation with a friend about this a couple of years ago, who's also a writer. And I kept telling her, I feel like I have nothing to say. And this was actually for Girlhood, the book, where I was like, oh, I have a deadline, but I'm really worried that everything has been said already. And I don't have anything to add. And I realized that a lot of my fear was coming from the fact that I felt like I was going to write bad words, and I just couldn't get out of my head. And so I decided that instead of opening my doc, where I was my Google Doc, where I was supposed to be writing these words in an official capacity, I was just going to write an email to a friend. And as I said before, emails to friends are kind of my magic trick for my own brain. So I opened the email draft, and it was just word vomit, where I started writing about all of my insecurities and all the things that I felt like I didn't have to say, or that I was worried about. And eventually I had all of that was out of my system. And then I just started writing about but I think this is really interesting because X, Y, and Z. And I think we need to know this, this, and this. And the last, third of that email is part of what my book introduction is. But it took me a lot of just getting through my feelings and knowing that I had a safe space to write, where I never sent that email. It was just an email draft. But knowing that I had an audience in my mind of someone who was caring and was interested in what I had to say, and generally wasn't ever mean when I shared my thoughts or feelings, really helped me with getting past the hump of okay, I read everything, or I've read a lot about this. I don't know that I have anything to add. I don't really know how to frame it, to just getting out of my own head and putting words on a page.
You mentioned that you read a lot. What would you say was your favorite book as a teen, or your favorite book is now, or the authors that you think do an exemplary job at the things that you love to see and that you take inspiration from?
That is such a good question. So my favorite book as a kid, not a teen, but my favorite books as a kid, which I've been thinking a lot about right now. So I grew up in India. We moved in India, and then I moved to the US when I was 11, 12. And I read a lot of the Babysitter's Club, which I know is young, but I'm a diabetic. And when I got sick, I didn't know anyone else who was a diabetic. And my parents found this uncle in his 70s who came and talked to me. And he was lovely and wonderful, but he was in his 70s and couldn't really relate to me as a 9-year-old and the struggles I had. And one of the characters in the Babysitter's Club books was a diabetic, and I found that reading about her fictionalized experiences really helped me, because it was helping me make sense of oh, this is the way other people feel. Also, I'm not the only diabetic in the world, because for a period of time I felt like I probably was, even though I knew the data would say otherwise. I just didn't know anyone who was going through those experiences. And as I've gotten older and through my teen years and through my adult years, I feel a lot of my reading generally veers in that direction, where I'm looking for stories where I feel seen, or I feel something I'm working through is something that the book is also working through. So the types of books I've enjoyed, one of my favorite books is Exit West by Mohsin Hamid, because it's about existing between countries, and it's a refugee love story, and I'm not a refugee, but it feels like a book that I really relate to, because it's about like the things and the people you leave behind when you leave home, and what like living in the in-between is like. Another book that I really love is by a journalist, Filomena. It's called I Was Told to Come Alone. And she's, again, like a journalist who exists between worlds a little bit, is an immigrant, and is like trying to make sense of like how to tell stories about her people being people from multiple countries. So those are the types of books I tend to gravitate toward, where right now, at least, those are the books that I'm gravitating toward a lot, which are books where people are making sense of like how to exist between worlds.
So Girls Right Now is all about creating a community with other writers. So how do you create community with other writers, and do you think that doing it is important?
I think it's so important. It's, for me, it's been a lifelong process where I feel like I've kept track of people who are creatives and writers and artists and filmmakers and people who are thinking about telling stories in different ways, because it helps to know that you're not alone in the process of creation. So for me, I have a couple of friends who we have like every other week check-ins where we talk through the projects we're working on, the things we're stumbling through, the thing, like we workshop each other's work, we talk through edits we have, or just when we get in our head about like, is this important? Is this interesting? How do I tell this story? We all also, and some of these are like in one group and some of these are separate friends. And a lot of us also have helped each other out in different types of projects. And I find it really helpful, because I think community is at the core of everything. And there are lots of things that I can help other people out with, and there are things that they can help me out with. And none of us have to be in this alone, and none of us should be in this alone. And writing can be such a solitary exercise, because you're just in conversation with yourself as you're creating. And it's always helpful to remember that even though like it's just you and the words that you're creating and putting out into the world, there are other people who are thinking through the same types of things as you are, and who can help you navigate the process.
Thank you so much, Masuma, for joining today, despite the internet issues and also despite the fact that it's very late where you are right now. Thank you so much for this.